John Dillinger was the son of the owner of this grocery store in Indianapolis. The man who was to become the most famous outlaw in a time of outlaws was born in this house 31 short years before his violent death. Traumatically, his mother died when he was 3. At school, he became known as a tough and lonely lad, leader of a neighborhood gang he called the Dirty Dozen. Beaten regularly by his God-fearing father, he was reluctant to help on the farm John Wilson Dillinger started in 1920 near the little town of Mooresville. Johnny got into a series of scrapes. He and his gang broke into factories, he dropped out of school, worked at a series of jobs in machine shops, and hung around the pool halls. One night in 1923, his father refused to let him use the family car, so he stole one. Picked up on suspicion by the local police, he was afraid to go home. Instead, he enlisted in the Navy. But discipline and John Dillinger didn't go together, and he deserted from the USS Utah after only a few months. By the age of 21, he was back in Mooresville. There he was arrested again, this time for stealing chickens, but the sentence was quashed. Impulsively, he married a teenager and moved in with her parents. Under her influence, he got a job in a furniture factory as an upholsterer and joined the local baseball team. But soon he and a new friend were planning a robbery. This store was their target. The hold-up went badly wrong when they found that the storekeeper had no money. They hit him over the head and their gun went off harmlessly. Young Dillinger was arrested. Promised leniency, he confessed. But without a lawyer, he was sentenced to a minimum of 10 years in the state reformatory. Shocked at the severity of the sentence, the townsfolk petitioned for leniency, but it was all to no avail. The door had clanged shut for 10 years. Bitter and resentful, Dillinger decided to treat this as an education in crime, and in Indiana State Penitentiary he found willing teachers. From them he compiled a list of banks to rob in the Midwest, and by the time his sentence was up, he had recruited a gang of experts to attack them. Within 3 months of his release in 1933, they had robbed their first bank at Dalesville, Indiana. This raid set the pattern for the future, including a graceful leap over a 6-foot counter by the dashing Dillinger, in the manner of his screen hero, Douglas Fairbanks. In 4 months, they robbed 5 more banks, but Dillinger had been captured. He was being held in Lima, Ohio, but was not too worried. He was confident that help was on the way. He had good reason. With part of the proceeds from the bank robberies, he had smuggled a barrel of guns and ammunition to friends he had left in Michigan City Penitentiary. With this arsenal, 10 of them now shot their way out and headed towards Lima to free their liberator. Among them were the legendary Handsome Harry Pierpont, who had already tried 4 escapes. Charlie Mackley, whose bank robbing technique was to pretend to be a director of the bank, and Russell Clark, younger than the others, but already an experienced robber. At Lima jail, all 3 posed as police officers. They asked to see Dillinger. But Sheriff Jess Saba was suspicious. "Let me see your credentials," he demanded. "Here they are," replied Pierpont, producing his gun and firing. He killed the sheriff, located the key, and released his friend. John Dillinger asked casually, "What kept you?" They raced out of a side door and into a waiting car. Dillinger had his ideal gang, and its first raids were on police gunrooms in Auburn and Peru, Indiana. Now well armed, they robbed the American Bank and Trust Company in Racine, Wisconsin, of $27,000. Joined by Dillinger's girlfriend, Billy Frechette, and Pierpont's, Mary Kinder, in East Chicago, Indiana, they were scooping $20,000 into bags when the police arrived. Patrolman William O'Malley fired 4 shots at Dillinger, who shouted, "You asked for it," and shot the policeman dead. They got away in a fast car. Dillinger had killed his first man. As the gang crisscrossed the Midwestern states, in Dillinger's first spree of robberies, the American public turned a villain into a hero. The handsome, athletic outlaw seemed to be more of a Robin Hood than an Al Capone. Along with Pretty Boy Floyd and Bonnie and Clyde, He appeared to embody the hit-the-rich heroics of the legendary Jesse James. The disillusioned public of the Depression years felt that the banks, with their high interest rates and eager foreclosings, could well afford the losses. A shocked President Roosevelt appealed for a change of attitude.
Can be stopped, and it will be stopped.
Dillinger's supporters were shattered when he was arrested at this house in Tucson, Arizona, and disarmed by a local posse. Fire had broken out at the Congress Hotel where the gang was staying. They gave the firemen a $12 tip for rescuing one of their trunks, which contained enough guns and ammunition to equip a small army. The generous tip made the firemen remember them, and when they saw the picture of the wanted gang, they were able to identify them as Clark, Mackley, Pierpont, and Dillinger. What followed was more like a movie premiere than the capture of a real-life killer. Every state where Dillinger's gang committed crimes was anxious to extradite them, and legal battles loomed ahead. Indiana moved fastest, and before a writ of habeas corpus could be granted to keep the gang in Arizona, its lawyers laid on aircraft to get Dillinger securely back there to be tried for murder. He became one of the first prisoners to be transported by air. To this day, prisoners in the United States are still routinely moved only by rail or road. The scenes were just as extraordinary in Chicago, where he was met by a convoy of 85 police in 13 cars, with 12 motorcycle outriders. Thousands of people lined the streets, hoping for a glimpse of their hero, the law's villain. Waiting across the state line at Crown Point Jail, Indiana, was the lady sheriff, Lillian Holly, who was filling in the term of office for her late husband, a sheriff who had been murdered. She and the attorney assigned to prosecute him, Robert Estill, were only too pleased to pose with the world's most celebrated criminal. She boasted that there were 8 locked doors between Dillinger and freedom. Outside in the grounds, Sheriff Holly posted a battalion of deputies with shotguns. The local judge refused to sign an order transferring his prize to Michigan Penitentiary, a decision that was to lose all 3 of the publicity-seeking officials their jobs. For as soon as the rifle-toting deputies were removed and things had calmed down a bit, Dillinger persuaded his lawyer, Louis Piquet, to bribe a corrupt judge to smuggle him a gun. Later, Dillinger claimed that he had fashioned a replica gun out of wood and finished it off with boot polish. On March the 3rd, 1934, at 8:30 in the morning, Dillinger stuck his gun, real or replica, into the ribs of a guard. Walking through this kitchen, he collected some machine guns from a locked closet and armed a fellow prisoner to help in his escape. With the guard as hostage, they walked out of the side entrance. His fellow escaper climbed these gates to make sure the coast was clear. It was. They walked through the police garage, which was unlocked and unguarded. Then they strolled right round this suburban block at a leisurely pace to avoid suspicion. They turned into this alley and made for the side door of the Ford garage in Main Street, next to the jail he had just escaped from. He forced the man in charge of the garage to give him a car and join the party as another hostage. Then they all got in the car, and Dillinger forced the guard to drive them as quickly as possible out of town. A mailman, Robert Volk, watched the escape happen and telephoned the police. They didn't believe him, so he ran to the guard of the criminal court building, who didn't believe him either. He finally had to ring the doorbell of the jail and tell them. Ed Sager, the garage man hostage, told how the outlaw sang "Get Along Little Doggie" and "I'm Heading for the Last Roundup" as they drove. Meanwhile, his 3 accomplices were being extradited to Ohio to face trial for the murder of the sheriff they had killed when they sprung Dillinger from Lima jail. Traveling by train, they were met by armed guards. Russell Clark wore a bandage from his battle with the Tucson cops. They were kept in the old state prison at Columbus, Ohio, and immediately started preparing for their own escape. Aware of their prisoners' reputations, the prison authorities mounted extra guards. The governor was given special protection in case Dillinger should try to free his accomplices by kidnapping him. Pierpont and Mackley were sentenced to death, and Clark to life imprisonment. Pierpont died in the chair, but Mackley was shot during an escape attempt. With his closest confederates out of the game, John Dillinger formed a new gang. But the simple mistake of driving a stolen car across the state line brought him up against a new enemy, for he had now committed a federal offense. J. Edgar Hoover, chief of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, was able to involve his formidable organization. A special 40-man team was set up under the leadership of Agent Melvin Purvis. A $10,000 reward was put on the head of the man the FBI now designated their public enemy number 1. Among the members of the new gang was the notorious Babyface Nelson. Born Lester Gillis, he had chosen the name Big George Nelson as more dashing, only to see it nullified by the nickname Babyface. Unlike the rest of the gang, who killed to avoid arrest, Babyface Nelson enjoyed the act and had to be restrained from using his Tommy gun on the slightest excuse. Sightings of Dillinger were reported by the public as a second spree of robberies began. Roadblocks and searches failed to stop the gang as they raced across the plains. During their first raid at Sioux Falls, South Dakota, Babyface Nelson killed an off-duty policeman. Then followed raids in Mason City, Iowa, where $34,000 was netted. In Minneapolis, where the gang escaped from a police trap. In Carthage, Illinois, and Mankato, Minnesota. Back in St. Paul, Dillinger rented an apartment with Billy Frechette, but suspicious neighbors called the FBI, and Dillinger only escaped after a shootout in which he was shot in the leg. Realizing that he must get well away from St. Paul, on the 5th of April 1934, Dillinger made a sentimental pilgrimage back home to Mooresville, where he and his aged father forgave one another. They held a secret party for family and friends, while FBI, unaware their quarry was there, watched the farm. The elder Dillinger later recorded an optimistic and extraordinary appeal for clemency.
I'm John Dillinger's father, and I feel like that if John was given a parole or exonerated for what he has done, I don't think he's done near as much as they claim he has, but I think if he's given a chance, would go straight. And as far as the family reunion, the claim we had, we just happened to have a Sunday dinner, and no preparations made only for the dinner, but we didn't know that John was coming. John just happened to drop in on us.
His son introduced the family to Billy Frechette as his future wife, but 4 days later she was arrested and charged with harboring him. In the middle of the night of April the 13th, Dillinger and his new trusted associate, Homer Van Meter, drove north, desperate to replenish their supply of arms, which had been left behind in St. Paul. In the town of Warsaw, Indiana, they discovered that the police station and armory had only one man on duty. It seemed an ideal opportunity. Their raid was witnessed by the local firemen, who later told reporters that he had been unable to leave his post to raise the alarm as he watched Dillinger and Van Meter break in. On duty was Police Officer Pettinger, and he later described how he had at first refused to hand over the keys. Dillinger tried to get them away from him, and there was a lively struggle, during which Van Meter tried to shoot the policeman, but dared not do so for fear of hitting Dillinger. It ended with Officer Pettinger being hit over the head 4 times by Van Meter. Now the gang decided it needed a holiday before its next coup, and with several young ladies in tow, it drove north, via Sault Ste. Marie to Little Bohemia Lodge on Little Star Lake near Mercer in northern Wisconsin. This isolated resort, out of season, was an ideal hiding place. Dillinger, Red Hamilton and friends were in the main building. Babyface Nelson, Van Meter and wives were in a cabin at the lakeside. The lodge was owned by Emil Wanatka, who quickly guessed the identity of his guests and got word out to the FBI. But the guard dogs barked, and the G-men opened fire prematurely. They shattered the lodge's windows and wounded innocent guests and staff. In the ensuing gun battle, an agent was killed by Babyface Nelson, while the outlaws climbed out of the back windows and escaped along the lake. They had to leave behind most of their guns, their lady friends and their cars. Despite roadblocks, they escaped in a car stolen from Mr. and Mrs. Lang, a couple who lived nearby. Other innocent victims of the bungled raid included 2 local men who had been drinking at Bohemia Lodge when the firing began. Now they shared a hospital room with the dying Carl Christiansen, a local constable who tried to stop the fugitives. The body of Special Agent Carter Baum was taken back to Washington. Among the gang, only Red Hamilton had been wounded. He later died of gangrene. Dillinger buried him in a gravel pit with lye on his face and fingertips to prevent identification. Embarrassed by the fiasco, J. Edgar Hoover supervised the printing of posters doubling the reward and put his agents under notice to deliver Dillinger dead or alive. John Dillinger's last heist took place on the 30th of June 1934, 8 days after his 31st birthday at South Bend, Indiana. Now so infamous that despite plastic surgery he was afraid to show his face anywhere in public, he wanted enough money to go and set himself up in Mexico. The gang robbed the Merchants National Bank of a disappointing $24,000. They left behind them a dead traffic policeman and 6 wounded citizens. Of the robbers, Van Meter was wounded, but he survived to die in another shootout with the police. Around this time in Chicago, a man calling himself Jimmy Lawrence started going out with a waitress called Polly Hamilton. For extra cash, she occasionally worked as a call girl. On the night of July the 22nd, he asked her to go to the Biograph with him. He invited the madame she worked for along. The scene was set for an extraordinary episode. The madame, a Romanian illegal immigrant, Anna Sage, was certain Jimmy Lawrence was really John Dillinger, and she made a deal with the FBI. She would wear something bright so they could spot him coming out. Later she explained her reasons.
When I learned he was Dillinger, I knew he had been killing without mercy. So I went to a policeman I knew, and he arranged a conference with the government agents. So July 22nd, I called Mr. Purvis, and I told him that Dillinger was going to a show. The government agent would follow us. When we came out, they tried to capture Dillinger, and he was killed. So I've done my part. Only thing I ask is what the government promised me, that I could stay here with my husband and son and not be deported to Romania.
In the event, her request to stay in America was denied. She just got $5,000 of the reward money from the FBI and lasting fame as the Lady in Red. This was how a contemporary newsreel described the ambush.
At about 10 o'clock, Dillinger walked out of the theater with his mouse, who were about to sell him to justice for a price. The federal agents were watching. Tensely and silently, they closed in about him. Suspicious and alert, Dillinger sensed that something was wrong. His hand flew to the gun hidden in his pocket. He was going to fight it out with the law. But a federal agent beat him to the draw and sent a bullet crashing through his skull to emerge beneath the right eye. In spite of the fatal shot, the Hoosier hoodlum ran into the alley, but fell with 2 more bullets searing into his body. Rushed to the Alexian Brothers Hospital, it was found that Dillinger had paid the price for his crimes before his patrol wagon ambulance reached that abode of mercy.
I arrived at the scene of the shooting of John Dillinger and found that the body had been taken to the Alexian Brothers Hospital, and from there to the county morgue. I went to the county morgue and questioned the government agents, who told me that they had shot John Dillinger as he drew a gun in front of the theater. I then searched the body and found from my search that it was John Dillinger, as there was a picture of Evelyn Freschetti, his sweetheart, in the watch. Also, the picture that Corner Walsh had furnished us was absolutely a duplicate of the deceased John Dillinger.
But was it really John Dillinger? Dillinger's eyes were blue-grey. The dead man had brown eyes. Dillinger had several scars. The dead man had none. Dillinger had never had rheumatic fever. The dead man's heart showed that he had. Dillinger had perfect eyesight. The dead man wore prescription glasses. These few objects were all that the man they claimed was John Dillinger left behind. But underworld rumors said that this masterpiece of the embalmer's art was not the most famous American outlaw, and that he really retired to Los Angeles. His body, if it was his, was taken in a wicker basket for burial. A crowd of 5,000 mourners attended the funeral. He was a hero to the people of the Depression, with its millions of impotent victims. As Woody Guthrie sang, "As through this world you wander, and through this world you roam, you will never find an outlaw turn a family from its home."